Wayne, we're so happy to have you with us. Please, let's talk about cybersecurity.
All right. Thank you, Barry, and good day to everyone that has joined us. Well, today, as Barry mentioned, we want to talk about cybersecurity. And to do that, have kind of, I think, three main areas I'd like to talk about. First is just a overview of some of the fundamental principles of cybersecurity, and then, of course, look at the threats. Because one aspect of cybersecurity in implementing preventions is also to understand the threats. And then we want to focus primarily on ransomware, because that is probably one of the most popular threats that we are faced today. And then I will leave you with some thoughts and some resources for maybe some further study on the topic. So let's look at some of the principles involved. And maybe a first place to begin is what really is cybersecurity. And of course, there's a pretty broad definition that is focused on the protection of basically an IT infrastructure or IT assets, which can be, of course, host devices, computers, network infrastructure, the applications, programs, and of course the data, or in our case as a broadcast station, some of the content that is transported. Well, what does this all have to do with the broadcaster? Well, if we think about how our broadcast plant or infrastructure has evolved from the days of what I often refer to as a baseband plant, where we are sending our audio, in the case of TV, audio and video, around as a discrete baseband signal. Now, of course, that's moved into the IT realm, and the internet protocol has become a common transport for us. As a result, that baseband plant now looks more like maybe a server room. And I'll use a quote from Chris Alexander with that, because many of our broadcast specific functions are performed effectively by a computer. So with that, we of course have all the advantages of that IT infrastructure, which I want to elaborate there. But one of the downsides to that is we do have an IT infrastructure, and as a result, cybersecurity is really not something that's a luxury. It's something we really must have to address today. And one way to look at it, it's sort of like doing any type of preventive maintenance, whether it is that preventive maintenance maybe at the transmitter plant, spending some time and maybe a little money up front along the way often is a lot cheaper in the long run than waiting for a meltdown and being faced with that higher cost impact. So we want to be proactive in our cybersecurity efforts. Well, our first place to maybe begin in terms of our principles is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. This is something put together by the National Institutes of Standard and Technology that basically provides a structured outline of best practices regarding cybersecurity implementation. It is considered kind of the industry guideline or baseline for practices regarding cybersecurity. The framework is divided into what is referred to as 5 core areas. Identification, which is simply focused on identifying all of your IT assets or inventorying those assets maybe, because often most people have more IT assets than they really realize that they have. And the important part of this inventory then can begin to develop kind of a roadmap. Okay, these are the items I have to protect. How do I protect those devices with down to, actionable steps, depending on what the devices are. We certainly want to protect the infrastructure, and we'll talk a lot about some of the means to do that, but basically maybe controlling access to that infrastructure, maybe it's encrypting the data. And an important part is the detection, the monitoring of the network, or know what is normal for your IT infrastructure, because often when those anomalies occur, that could indicate a cybersecurity event. And of course, you need a plan to respond, to pick up the pieces, so to speak, and continue your core business. And of course, the recovery. How do you go about doing that? And with that, this is the NIST framework. On the surface, the framework can be sort of daunting. But as you begin to drill down in it, and then with each of these core areas, then is a specific area, and you continue drilling down, and actually you finally get to some actionable, tangible steps with references that will help you make that implementation of that specific area. Some other principles that we will also acknowledge is the defense in depth, which is an approach that was developed by the National Security Agency, which is simply a use of coordinated multiple layers of protection. I often use a diagram of a castle to illustrate that principle, simply because you have multiple layers of protection. If one layer is breached, well, there's another barrier that you're facing, and so forth and so on. Another principle is that of least privilege, where you simply grant users and applications, and I really emphasize the application side because this is often overlooked, but you simply grant the minimum resources and authorization or the rights that are needed to do a given job or a given function. Often rights are granted as virtually none to the door is wide open. So again, the idea is you minimize that access to only what is necessary to perform the given role of that individual or the function of that application. Another terminology you might see with this concept is basically you deny by default and then you grant as required or needed. And finally, we have the risk-based approach analysis, which I kind of equate to your credit score for your IT infrastructure in terms of cybersecurity. There is a lot to be done in the world of cybersecurity, and it's just simply can be daunting. So the idea is from, again, back to that inventory as our first step, we focus upon categorizing the different vulnerabilities in different categories, such as high impact, high likelihood. And this is where we would want to focus our resources to. Not to say that the other areas are not important, but maybe those low impact, low likelihood vulnerabilities, you may never get to those. But again, there's this scoring that can be done. And basically, this is the common thing that happens through security audits, that you might go to that outside firm to have done and spend some big mega bucks on these type of services to grant or come up with these scores. Now, the broadcast industry does not have any kind of regulatory requirements having to do with network infrastructures. Certainly a lot of industries do. You know, the financial industry comes into mind where there's governmental regulations. Will we have something someday from the FCC? Well, I'm going to I certainly don't have a good crystal ball, but it's not going to surprise me. Particularly, Barry had just mentioned the T-Mobile incident and the security breach that the FCC wants to investigate. So with that, we're sort of left on our own. Now, there are some free tools that you can use. This is one that I'll have a reference for in my reference page from the security scorecard that you can run. And I ran this one yesterday from my desktop, and let's just say I don't think I fared too well here in terms of that. And there's many factors. So this might be an interesting exercise for you sometime to see what at least an external view of your network and IT infrastructure might be in a broad set of areas. And then finally, we have the CIA Triad. And in many ways, this is kind of the classic cybersecurity model of the IT industry. Now, one thing, the acronym CIA has nothing to do with the Central Intelligence Agency. So often you will see this model referred to simply as the AIC Triad to minimize any confusion there. But the Triad is focused upon three areas. The first, of course, is confidentiality, which is the simple terms. That's simply privacy. We want to prevent information or data from reaching the wrong hands or an unauthorized user. To do that, you simply restrict or limit that access. And of course, in terms of a threat, this is often the target of social engineering, where someone is seeking to find out some type of sensitive information that can be used against you, so to speak. Again, several ways to implement prevention, such as encryption of data, obviously controlling access. We'll talk more about two-factor authentication and so forth. And in some cases, if that information does not need to be active online, we'll take it offline rather than having everything in the world always available instantly. We also have integrity, which is the step of preventing any information from being changed. Maybe it's changed while it's traversing a network infrastructure. It could be changed while it is being stored or changed during some processing workflow. Again, ways to implement that could be file access controls, checksums on files, and of course, encryption. And a very, very important part of maintaining integrity is to have some type of detection mechanism where you know there's been some tampering or manipulation of that data. And then finally, we have availability, which simply is ensuring that our IT resources, and again, resources can be a pretty vast assortment of things, from the network to server infrastructure to applications, the data or content associated with those applications, that they're simply available for legitimate users. And of course, this is the target of a denial of service attack, or a distributed denial of service attack, and of course, ransomware. In other words, hold that data or that information hostage for that. With that, oops, excuse me, I skipped too many slides. Keep the CIA Triad in mind, because in a few more slides, we want to look at a different perspective of that triad. So how do we secure the broadcast IT system? Well, we begin with the network, and that of course incorporates the infrastructure of all the hardware, but it also includes transmission paths. Those may be wired, copper, or twisted pair copper, or of course fiber, or wireless. In a reasonable environment today, most networks incorporate all of those three and so forth. We also have host devices that we have to secure, from the operating system, from maybe the storage aspect, to the applications. And then finally, we need a recovery plan. In case something happens, we need a structured way to return to normal operation, or that part of that business continuity plan. A key part is you're never done, essentially, because cybersecurity is this circular process that, again, you're simply never done. And for the broadcast IT engineer, I look at this is job security of continuous employment, because you are never done, because there's a endless process, because the landscape is continually changing. So let's begin by securing the network. And how do we actually go about doing that? Well, one of the first steps is we want to segment the network to simply minimize the attack surface, or in the case of a cybersecurity event occurring, we want to minimize the blast zone, as it's often referred to. And we do that by simply dividing the network in some type of logical or functional layers or segment. I often use the example of an onion to illustrate that principle. And for our broadcast network, we may divide that network into 5 areas or 5 zones, such as is illustrated here. Now, to actually implement that concept, it might look like this in terms of actual hardware implementation, with the innermost network being the most secure, and of course the outermost networks being less secure, but again having security. Now, on the surface, that looks like a lot of network equipment to implement. And in some ways, it very well could be, but often it really is not. That can all be implemented often in one Ethernet switch. Of course, if 48 ports is not enough for you, there's ways to expand the switch. But the key is to have a layer 3 switch, which is a little bit confusing, I think, at times, because we always associate Ethernet switching as a layer 2 function. IP routing, of course, is a layer 3 function. So what is a layer 3 switch? Well, to me, that's a marketing term that has been generated for a device that does both the conventional layer 2 switching as well as the layer 3 functions, all in one physical box. So where do we go next? Well, I'd like to suggest that the OSI model offers a perfect structure for us to implement this defense in depth concept, where we want to do things in a coordinated, multi-layered manner. In other words, we just don't want to randomly do things within our IT infrastructure. We want to do things in a structure and a coordinated manner. And again, I suggest the OSI model makes the perfect roadmap, so to speak, follow, by specifically following the first 4 layers, which are considered the data flow layers of the OSI model. First, we have the physical layer, which I equate to physical access. We simply want to control physical access to the network infrastructure, and that can be certainly done in many ways. Maybe in a small environment, that's just a single locked cabinet with my IT equipment in it. In a larger facility, that could certainly be an entire room dedicated to IT resources, or in a lot of stations, maybe this is your technical operations center, your rack room, or whatever name you want to give to that. And of course, with that, you have controlled access to it. And I might suggest this is probably not the best way to implement that controlled access, but at least I guess there is a control there. As we move up the OSI model to layer 2, we want to utilize Ethernet switch security capabilities, specifically capabilities that exist in a managed Ethernet switch. And by this, then we can control what host devices are attached to a given switch port. We've implemented one layer of security with the physical access, in other words, prevent things from being tampered with. Our next layer is through the switch port security. If a foreign device is plugged into a given switch port, then the switch, of course, detects that is a foreign device. It drops that frame, disables that port, and of course, generally, you would have it set up to send a notification to the broadcast IT engineer that a port violation has occurred. Now, who are you trying to protect here from this physical? Are you worried about someone walking into your facility and messing with stuff? Well, that certainly could happen, but probably not. You're protecting against your own employees that in most cases are trying or attempting to do their job, and there's been a roadblock put in place that they're not able to do that. And I think maybe of the 6 p.m. Saturday night newscast, when that story that just happened has to get on the air and something does not work right, that is maybe preventing that transfer of that file now to the server so it can be aired. And someone says, well, I can plug my notebook computer in and transfer that over. And along with that file comes some type of malware or so forth. Next, we move up to layer 3, or the network layer, where we implement things like packet filtering, access control, and encryption. That may be done through an access control list or a firewall as well. And of course, through encryption of IP security. And at the transport layer and above, we can basically implement encryption and authentication. Because one thing we have to keep in mind, IP as a protocol was not designed to be secure, so it has to be secured by various means. So how do we secure broadcast host devices? And of course, we find, I think, what I'll call conventional desktop computers that we have, but we also have a lot of specialized applications that are executed in our environment, from automation systems to audio processing and content delivery and so forth, to a pretty wide variety of devices that don't necessarily look like the traditional IT hardware that often a lot of cybersecurity is focused upon. But yes, we may have a transmitter, but it has a control system that is a computer, or an EAS decoder, or a variety of devices, including kind of some standard IT hardware. Maybe that Dell server that is executing some customized software that is performing a workflow function in that broadcasting plant. So there's some general steps. We won't spend time reading through all of these, but kind of some general things to do there. Likely, all of these devices are going to probably have one of 3 operating systems. It's going to be Windows-based, it's going to be Linux-based, or it may have a proprietary operating system. And depending upon that operating system, that sort of governs, the specifics of what you do. And this is, of course, some generic things that need to be done, should be done as well for the Linux operating system as well. So let's look at some threats. And maybe a first place to start is, well, where are the sources of these threats? And of course, they can take on many sources, from nation states to what I'll call the conventional hacker, to even organized crime now is into hacking, the hacktivists, the disgruntled employee. The list is varied. If you've seen, I happen to run across the TV series, cable TV series, Mr. Robot. That is kind of a classic example of the hacktivist that comes into play, where the goal is to get the evil corporation, so to speak. And also, we can have accidental actions that just simply occurs. And of course, natural disasters. These are not necessarily cybersecurity events, but a lot of the precautions that you do to mitigate or minimize these can be used to help the recovery from these events. I think the two most appropriate ones, or maybe the likely ones, in my opinion, for a broadcast station, is the hacker and the hacktivist. And if I had my choice between the two, I think I would pick the black hat hacker, because they're simply out for money. That money may be in terms of extortion through ransomware, or maybe they're out to obtain sensitive information, content, whatever, that they could turn, or information that they could turn around and sell to someone for money. But another kind of attribute of the hacker is that they're looking for the easy prey. If they encounter too much resistance, they just move on, because there'll be somebody else that'll be that easy prey. The hacktivist is a little bit different. They generally have a grudge with you. They tend to be more patient. They tend to be more dedicated and persistent in their efforts. Well, we of course have a lot of things in terms of threats. Generally, I think you can put threats into two pretty broad categories, that of malware and the other having to do with network infrastructure and so forth. And within malware today, I think, again, ransomware is the biggest threat that exist. If we look at all of the different cyber attacks, they tend to have a pattern of the attack process to them that begins with network reconnaissance. In other words, I want to learn something. I want to discover a host device that I might use in my cybersecurity efforts. There's, of course, exploits I need to implement. Once I've discovered a host device, I can implement my exploit. And also, a common trait is they want to maintain this persistent access. Often, hosts are discovered and accessible, but that doesn't mean there's a threat instantly installed. They may come back later and say, can I access this host device again and again? And then finally, that threat is installed, or in that malware or whatever. And maybe that host device is used as a jumping pad to other host devices in the network. And finally, successful installing that exploit, harvesting that information, or if it's the goal is destruction, that is implemented. So what we want to do is stop this whole process at the network reconnaissance stage. In other words, we don't want our host devices to be discovered, or at least we want to reduce the visibility of those host devices to prevent that reconnaissance or that exploring a network. If you're interested in some of the analysis of past cybersecurity attack events, here's a website that can take you to some very in-depth sequences of how attacks have occurred and the process, which if this is an area of interesting, can make some some fascinating late night reading at times. Well, we've talked about the CIA triad, but let's look at the CIA triad from a different perspective. Look at it from the perspective of the hacker. This now becomes the target. So those areas of confidentiality become a target. That area of integrity becomes a target, and certainly availability becomes a target for the hacker to attempt to expose. We mentioned you want to minimize, if not eliminate, this exploring or network reconnaissance are happening, but how do you actually, or what can you learn from that? Well, first you have to discover a host device, and I have an IP address that I know there's some kind of host device there. I have no idea what that device may be. Well, I can discover the operating system of that device. From there, I can also determine what operating or version of that operating system is. I can discover active ports. Active ports also are associated with a given service or application that host device is executing. And from learning those services, I can learn versions of that. And with that information, I then can make an evaluation for vulnerabilities, gain some insight to possibly compromising that host, including even things like default logins, a host device that those defaults have not been changed, and maybe even compromise that host and bingo, gain access to it and proceed from there. So how do you go about doing such a thing? Well, to do such, you need some tools, and there's a lot of tools out there that are available. As Google search will turn, I think, more responses than you probably really want. But in general, the 10 most popular tools today are shown here. Some of them, their names might suggest what they do. Others are somewhat not as clear. But from that, there's a couple I think that are most popular, and that is Nmap, and that is Metasploit. These hacker tools are also the most popular tools used to do penetration testing. In other words, use a hacker tool to attempt to exploit vulnerabilities within an IT infrastructure. So what can you learn? Well, let's take this particular device. And by the way, I'm not picking on any manufacturers in my examples here. I'm simply using equipment examples that I have in my broadcast plant for the examples. So in this case, let's take Nmap. Well, on the surface, Nmap is sort of boring. It's a command line application, but there's also a companion to it called ZenMap, which gives us a graphical or a GUI interface, which has actually some pretty useful features to it, particularly even in training. So this is a partial screenshot of a scan of this particular host device. And again, this is just a small sampling of the information returned. If you actually printed out this output screen, there's probably nearly 4 foot of paper that you would end up with. So what I'm going to do is try to capture and blow up just some specific examples from this screen. Well, first of all, we've discovered 4 open ports. And of course, each of these ports can be associated with a given application, a given service. These are all considered common or registered ports. Of course, port 80 is likely familiar to you, as well as port 443. 631 may not be too common, but that's the Internet Printing Protocol. Again, for what this particular host device does, no real surprises here. We also can look and again obtain versions of these services are there. And with this version information, then I can make an evaluation of, are there some vulnerabilities that I might be able to exploit, including even default passwords. And their default login and password information readily available for a wide variety of products that exist out on the internet, not just broadcast equipment, but IT equipment in general. If you're not familiar with the basically website Showdown, that's something you probably should be. And if you are familiar with it, hopefully I won't bore you with too much with this slide, but Showdown is basically a website that is a search tool for IP host. Originally, it began back in the days when IP web cameras became popular, and it was commonly used to search for cameras and see if you could log into them, and gosh, see what you could see, I guess, was the sport there. But it uses Nmap as its engine to perform its searches. And I did 3 quick searches. Again, I'm not picking on manufacturers here. I'm using common manufacturers such as Barracks and Comrex and Tyline, and we come up with a few thousand devices that are visible. Now, of these devices, am I going to sit there and try to log into every one of them and see if they've changed the passwords? I probably am not going to do that. Maybe I randomly do that for some reason, but generally not. That's not what I'm worried about. So again, preventing this reconnaissance or this exploring is one of our first steps. Let's talk about the hacker. Generally, we talk about the white hat hacker or the black hat hacker. Actually, there's a third one we want to mention as well. The white hat hacker, their intent is really to protect an IT system. So they want to use hacking tools to test for vulnerabilities. Often you'll hear this referred to as ethical hacking and doing penetration testing. In other words, can I discover vulnerabilities? We also have the gray hat hacker, often referred to as the script kiddie. This is the intent here is simply the challenge. It's not necessary to do harm to your IT infrastructure, but the intent is just the challenge of accessing something that I'm not supposed to be able to access. Unfortunately, the saying about, things happen. Accidents can occur with script kiddies, and there ends up actually being harm done, even if there was no intent to do harm. But the black hat hacker, this is what we're really concerned about. And this is someone that wants to do harm in some way. Maybe that's destructive harm. Maybe it is to steal information. Maybe it is to hold our infrastructure hostage through ransomware. We often see images of a hacker. You know one when you see one because it's always a guy, always in a dark room wearing a hoodie. Okay, makes a pretty good representation, I guess. But in the reality, that's not really the hacker. This is your hacker. It's a data center, and it is scripts that are being executed that are exploring and looking for potential hosts. Once a host is found, further scripting done to see what can be discovered. And maybe it gets to a person to actually exploit. But this is the world today in terms of our threats. Now, of course, there also is cybercrime as a service. If we go back in the good old days of hacking, you had to have some technical skills, some technical knowledge of how things work to do hacking. If you don't recognize the two gentlemen in this picture here, on the left is Steve Jobs, and on the right is Wozniak. In their early days prior to Apple, their claim to fame were as hackers. But today, I can simply hire those services that I need. So let's talk about ransomware in our next few minutes. Again, part of the importance of understanding any threat is understanding that threat, and that's my insight as to how I might prevent that. So ransomware is simply a malicious malware that infects and encrypts files. In other words, we deny access. We impact that availability. And of course, there's a ransom demanded to maybe de-encrypt those files and return that access. Ransomware is commonly delivered by phishing or what is often referred to as a drive-by file download. In other words, I access a compromised website and I download a file in the background that I don't even know is happening. And of course, you get that dreaded message about your resources have been locked. So how do we protect this? Well, one of the ways, again, we want to minimize that attack surface. So if something does happen, we minimize the impact or that blast zone I referred to. Having, reliable, valid backup data is essential to protecting that. External storage of that data, endpoint protection, particularly endpoint protection in terms of what is often referred to as deep packet inspection. In other words, I'm looking for potential file applications that can do that encryption. And then, of course, education of users. Make them aware of be careful clicking on unknown attachments and so forth, or URLs. Preventing it, again, we want to maintain caution in opening URLs, opening email, keep our antivirus up to date. Once again, educate users. When we have an event, I think it's important to isolate the system, turn it off, disconnect it from the network, secure any offline backups. Once again, back to educating users on what to do. And there's one kind of common thread between all of these is educating users to make them aware of ransomware. So how does it work? Well, there's a lot of ransomware out there. These are just a short list of some of the variants that exist today. Again, often executed through an email attachment or maybe a macro that's in a document, such as a PDF or a Word file, an Excel spreadsheet, whatever it may be. It also may be executed by a file from a compromised website obtained, as I mentioned, by a drive-by. And of course, the result is the dreaded message that is typically displayed. So real quickly, let's look at some of the specifics of how it might work. And this is an example for CryptoLocker, which is a relatively popular ransomware malware. So we've identified a target, and whether that's been a file or a user executed, that target host information has been captured. It is sent to what is often referred to as a attack server or attacker server that sends back some server keys and encryption keys, and bingo, files are encrypted and we get the dreaded message. An important aspect that is often done is the cleanup. In other words, remove all traces of what happened to reach this point of the files being encryption. In the encryption process, this is not something, though, that is instant. Usually, the local drive is impacted first, and then a search begins for other drives, such as an external drive that might be a USB connection or a mapped network drive. In a moment, that's why, or this is the reason often why when something occurs with malware, you want to get that system offline, unplugged, whatever, as quick as possible. Yeah, you've not necessarily prevented the attack, but maybe you've minimized how much gets compromised. There's also a relatively new malware called Repepsilon Red, and I mention it only because it's sort of different. The name comes from a Marvel comic, which is the name of a Russian super soldier. Now, I don't know if this suggests maybe the source of this malware or not. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but its entry point is through a Microsoft Exchange server. And it's interesting in that it is just a simple executable file. And it simply executes, it unpacks, and then it runs some scripts on a scheduled basis. This scheduled basis does not mean they all happen at once. They happen over and oftentimes a variable time scale that basically they do things such as kill and uninstall any security services, backup services like Windows Defender, for example. They delete any shadow copies. Shadow copies is a technique that Windows uses as a recovery feature in the operating system. They modify firewall rules, closing ports. Once again, deletes all the logs of what happened. And you, of course, get a pretty dull and boring text-based notification that your files have been encrypted. And this is the example of the 12 scripts, I guess, that are run that does things of what specifically things are done on that host device. How do you prevent this? Well, maintaining system patches certainly is very important, but also having the proper rights management. In other words, so that scripts cannot be executed. And of course, how do you recover? Well, I guess you pay the money or you rebuild the system, restore it from backups. And again, a URL for more information is interesting. Let's talk about backups. Backups is our best defense, but it's also a last resort that we have to resort to. So there's practices, though, that need to be taken into account for backup, how you actually do backups, when you do them, and things. Of course, tape is a convenient way to do that today. The LTO cartridges is a common way, but becoming more and more popular is to use spinning disk, maybe in a data center for backup. And of course, that may be your data center. That may be a service that you purchase. And of course, there's a wide variety of cloud storage providers out there. Again, a couple of cautions is to be careful with things such as mounting drives. It is very convenient for the user to have external drives mounted, but from a security standpoint, that's a bad idea. Ideally, you should attach to mount that drive when you need to. When you've done whatever you need to do, you disconnect or unmount from that. Of course, your backup frequency needs to be tied to your business. If your business is relatively stable, maybe every few days is adequate. If you're into a high transitional or transactional type business, maybe that is several times a day. And of course, you want to keep multiple copies. A common rule is to use the 3-2-1 rule, which is 3 copies of your data, 2 different types of storage, and one of those being offline. And also be aware and consider intelligent backup solutions that simply are solutions that attach to the IT infrastructure. When it's time to do a backup, they attach, they do their thing, then they disconnect from it. So they're not on lines all the time so that malware maybe not can see them. And of course, restoration, an important aspect is know what it takes to restore, particularly the time that it takes. And also you got to test and test and test that restoration project or process to know how to do it. So to leave you with some thoughts and resources, there is the ultimate network security, and that is, of course, the air gap. Maybe not practical in all applications, but in all seriousness, question, does a critical device really need to have network access, particularly maybe public network access? If it does, then take the necessary precautions to secure that device. Several cybersecurity resources, again, beginning with the NIST framework. The FCC Working Group 4 can be a useful document. If you should download it, don't be overwhelmed at the 300 or so page document. You're really only interested in about maybe 50 pages of that document that's focused on the broadcast sector. I believe that is chapter 9, if my memory serves me right. And particularly this document takes the NIST cybersecurity framework, and then it applies it to the broadcast industry. Actually, the whole document applies to many different forms of communications that fall under the FCC. But again, you're interested in just the broadcast section. I'd mentioned the security scorecard. You can see the URL there, and also some really good training resources for your users there at the end. Now let's look at the real world OSI model. We talked about the 7-layer OSI model. In reality, that is often a 10-layer model. And the 10th layer, or the user area, is one is most concerned, because this is where the phishing or the social engineering exploits occur, often the ID 10T area. Social engineering is a really, really big problem. It's become very successful because systems are now protected better than they used to be, and they're more difficult. Social engineering is often easier simply to exploit a human weakness and take advantage of that. So it's become very, very popular. And there's many different forms of social engineering that have various names associated with them and so forth. And again, a lot of the ways to prevent is education of employees. Certainly we want to implement our various provisions and stuff in terms of how do we prevent things through, let's say, multi-factor authentication and strong protocols for evaluations. Again, a URL for more reading, some resources, again, for educating your employees and so forth. Often that email with a subject line, these are taken from just this year and the first part of this year of some of the popular ones that's been used. When I first started doing cybersecurity presentations, I went back and looked, and I think I did the first one in 2016, and I had this list of 4 or 5 things as recommendations to do. And over the years, that list continues to grow. So I guess this is my 12 things short list to do. And I think some important points, I won't read through all of these because I know we're getting on in actually past the hour here, but there is really no single solution out there. There really are multiple things that should be done. Think about the low-hanging fruit. This will take care of often 80 to 90% of the vulnerability that is out there, in which exist in the cybersecurity world. Passwords, I cannot overemphasize, use strong passwords. This is a list of the 10 most popular passwords that are actually used, and this comes from some of the cybersecurity event analysis. It's interesting that these have been the same 10 passwords, I swear, for the last 5 years. They just sort of move around a little bit in order. And again, don't overlook social engineering and the phishing, because that can destroy a lot of work real quickly. Some final thoughts. Again, keep in mind that cybersecurity is an ongoing process. I preach that it begins with the network design, with that segmented network, and again, following best practices. Without there, again, keep in mind that weakest link. Well, we reach final thought, and I guess there's always one more thought to throw out. Do you have any disgruntled employees? I hope not. One of the latest or most recent ransomware attempts has been to target your employees and convince them to implement some ransomware in the infrastructure, and you do that for 1% of the ransom. Okay, and with that, here's some a URL you can read more about that attempt. And with that, I thank you for your time today. I welcome questions, as long as I guess Barry will let us sit here and chat, although I guess here in about 20 minutes, I need to move on to my next event. Contact information there. And I guess after Barry's introduction, I need to change my slide and make that lame duck president. So thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Wayne. Really, really appreciate. And got a lot of questions, a lot of comments that have queued up here. So we'll get to some of those, and no sound effects of duck farts. Ted Langdell said here, someone on the list was asking how to secure their station's automation computer from volunteers adding software like games and other unwanted items, or using it for non-automation uses.
Well, certainly, I think, in an environment, particularly where you are dealing with volunteers, that's often a bigger challenge, but you simply have to lock that host device down and use some tools that you already have. And that capability, certainly exists in Windows, as well as if it should be a Linux-based system, is basically lock the system down. The first step is to separate the default user admin account, separate those so that a user cannot, let's say, install some type of software to it. And you can even take that to the point of restricting access to things like the USB port and so forth. And of course, that can be done on an individual computer or individual host basis, which if you have a bunch of computers, that's sort of a pain to do from a time standpoint. So you might use something, again, use some tools such as Microsoft Domain Controller that lets you implement policies to a group of computers and more of an automated tool.
Would you suggest perhaps having no internet on the automation computer, but have a second computer in the room?
That is certainly a valid. Once again, goes back to that air gap comment. If a device really does not need to be on the network, don't put it on the network. And that might very well be that automation computer. If you have volunteers, hosts, whatever that need, let's say, some generic internet access, yes, give them a second computer, but also be careful what you attach that to network wise. Going back to that segmented network example, put that in its own quote layer or zone. I believe I used the example of the DMZ zone. Might be where you have your public Wi-Fi if you're providing that in your station environment.
I've seen stations where the USB ports have been disabled because people have either brought in a virus, or in one case, one of the consolidators, a flash drive was found on the streets of Chicago, a totally different city, with a lot of financial information.
Yep. You know, one time, I shouldn't digress here, but I often do in my weed. I found a USB stick in the parking garage in Las Vegas at NAB one year. And of course, I couldn't help but pick it up. And I took that thing home. Decided, what am I going to do with this? And finally, the curiosity got the best of me, and I had to plug it into a computer. And of course, fortunately, I had one that I was willing to risk and I kind of used for that sort of thing. Well, I found somebody's vacation pictures. Wish they knew who it was. I would have sent it to them. But, you know, that's something you never should do something like that.
I have a comment here from Mark Voris. He says, speaking of ports, we learned whatever ports don't need to be used should be not open. We had a transmitter that was victim to a hacker who flooded the boot sector with garbage, figured they came in through ports 21 or 22 that were open for SSH access.
Well, again, often you need ports open to perform a particular function that you need. And this is where I think you have to go back to, of course, you could maybe close those ports or disable that service, but that sort of defeats some useful features. So it kind of has to go back to that firewall. And maybe you have to restrict access to that particular host IP and those ports from, in a simple world, a single external device, but maybe it is a through an authenticated source. In other words, you do that through a VPN.
I had several people mention that the comment there of whitelisting those who could access. But even then, I mean, on my server, I turned the SSH off. And if I turned it on, I got something like 2 megabytes of attempts a day, people just to crash through with scripts or fake IDs or whatever.
Yep.
And it's within minutes. If they find you open, I close the SSH and it drops down. It's probably never going to go back to the 25 kilobit that I used to have, but it's somewhere around 100 kilobits a day of garbage. People try to knock on the door.
And Barry, that's a good point. That goes back to that kind of IT housekeeping. You have looked at your firewall to see what activity is going on. That is an important aspect to understand what is going on and what that firewall is doing. Mm-hmm. Part of that network monitoring, or know what is normal.
Looks like here, Dave Klein. Dave, is this what program you've put into practice? A non-password insertion of a thumb drive will cause the drive to be erased. Is that what you're doing? Or
He
did
he had to take off.
Oh, well, then we can't ask him, can we?
Well,
All right, well, moving on. Mark, you whitelist your things, and Tim Posar points out that VoIP PBX servers are notoriously exploitable. And he mentions here that they can be owned in a matter of minutes. There is a site or two, Wayne, that I have seen where you can insert a email address, and it will tell you if it has got its password known on the internet.
Yes, I cannot think of one of those right offhand, but there are one of those. If you use the Google browser and have their security stuff turned on, if you go and enter a compromised password, it'll flag you and tell you your password or your login credentials have been, have been compromised somewhere. Use something else.
I didn't see you listing any of them, but do you use them? Do you recommend any of them?
Well, I do use Google for that regard. And, after you see some of these major security breaches that occur, particularly if one of them catches my attention, hey, I had something to do with that company or whatever, I've used them there to, go see what is turned up. And I have found some of my login credentials that are on those compromised lists.
Oh, all right. Elaine Jones wants to mention an email preview program called Mail Washer. Maybe you could talk about that for just a moment.
Well, I don't think I know, I'm aware of Mail Washer, although that does sound like maybe that is a mail scanning tool, but I honestly don't know that one.
Elaine, talk to us.
I'll jump in for just a minute. I've used this thing for 10, 15 years. It's a company in New Zealand called Fire Trust, and they produce this mail washer that basically resides on the server wherever your email comes in. And I get a little flag every time email comes in, which in case of my business is every few minutes, and it'll show me basically the headers, the actual email addresses, all of the other information about somebody. And if the email looks suspect to me, like because I have a business email, I get frequent messages about accounts payable, accounts receivable, whatever. I just flag those messages for bounce, and they immediately get sent back to the user, to the sender, as though it was an invalid email address. And it also keeps my computer from getting cluttered up with email that I don't necessarily need to see. So I love that program, and it's just something that I recommend to people who get a lot of email and have occasionally been grabbed by a bad site.
Yeah.
I can only tell you that with Google Mail, I get a lot of false positives. I have to look at the Google stuff every day and sort them out. Okay. Let's see. I have one here. Someone talks about Showdown a little more. There's one here. Let's see. Something about credit cards. Oh, Tim, would you talk about that a little bit for Tim Posar? Are you still with us?
I am still here. So most companies that take credit cards, if you handle credit cards, you accept ones from your customers or whatever, have to go through some level of what's called PCI compliance. And it either may be like a self-administered certification you do, or you may actually have a third party that will also certify you. And in the case of the third party, there's companies like TrustWave and various other companies that will run scans against your network. And those will be very informative of exploits. In other words, are you running an Apache web server? Is it relatively old? Should it be patched? That sort of thing.
Right. That's basically a penetration test that is being performed. And actually that is kind of again, some of that best practice IT hygiene is to run a penetration test against, your own network to uncover those vulnerabilities, because things happen. You install maybe a software update that defaults a bunch of maybe changes you've made and opens a bunch of stuff, and you really don't know it. So, routinely doing a self penetration test is a very good move.
Mary Schnelly says that we should pay close attention to email addresses before opening email. And that's a good point, except that's one of the tricks that the bad guys use. They'll take over your email address and send it out to everyone in your address book. It's one of the reasons I don't want to use Outlook, but people have found that. One of the manufacturers, in fact, recently somebody stole his email address and sent out to thousands of people. And of course, predictably, he got thousands of people there. What are you doing for the... Not a good way.
These spammers don't even need to actually have your actual email address. They can, or control of your mailbox, as it were. They can just simply fake that it's coming from you. And I've seen a number of purported things coming about my own email, for example. It's crazy.
Yeah. Tim Sawyer mentions he uses "Who Are You" a lot to see who's out there. Let's see. Backups. Tim makes a very good point again, Mr. Posar. Yes, you make backups, but you got to check them out once in a while.
You got to test those. And I cannot emphasize testing enough, that you really can restore, whether that's an accidental failure, a hardware failure, or even the ransomware.
Yeah. Chris Hayes mentions that regular training is important. Never open an attachment you're not expecting. But we were talking about the weekenders. We were talking about using the internet and why locking that off of your mission critical computer is so important. One bad website and boom. Let's see. What do you recommend for reliable online penetration testing? Dave Doherty asked, and that was the one that you showed us, security.
Well, you could use the security scorecard. I just showed you the summary screen. In other words, my D security score. And it gives you a lot more specific information. At the same time, honestly, it doesn't give you enough specific information. I would suggest use Showdown and see what it tells you about yourself. Another one of my little war stories, and one of the presentations I was doing somewhere demonstrating, I just used my station call letters as a search term for Showdown, and boom, here this host device shows up. That's my automation device server. That's not supposed to be there, So things do happen.
Yeah. Maria makes a very good point. She says, we put all processed files on a scrubber machine before it goes to auto load. That's a good way to protect.
Yes, that's, we didn't get into a lot of the specifics, but using a proxy type device such as that is a good approach, because in our business, you do have a file. It's a story or whatever. It needs to move, let's say, from some external device, maybe into that content storage server, so it can be aired. But it needs to be moved and done in, I guess, a responsible way through a proxy or scrubber type device.
In addition to flash drives, we have a note here: found CDs in an airplane pocket. Financial information for one of the largest tower companies. They were very embarrassed.
That is that is an interesting for sure. We won't guess who that tower company might have been.
Quite so. Harold Hellekainen makes the point that he gets dark reading daily for security news, and he uses fail to ban, blocking IP addresses that have failed SSH logins. Problem with that, I found out because I was doing that every day for a while, and as I was advised, these are new botnets that they rotate every day, and you can sit there and you can block them and block them and block them, and they'll still come at you. Long as your IP address is out there. These
that was one of the reasons that I started using whitelisting on a
Mhm.
lot of my devices out in the field, because I had a couple of remote control units that were getting hammered by bots all the time, and was constantly having to reboot them to be able to get into them. So I finally whitelisted them, and then it all stopped.
Harold,
And another thing, you know, that I didn't really mention about a lot of our host devices, yeah, they're Windows or they're Linux, but they're running an embedded version, which has some advantages, but a lot of times those embedded systems really, they're somewhat fragile, and particularly you can do some aggressive scanning and you can crash those devices by, you know, too much traffic. And I know one particular remote control that can suffer that problem. You basically cause it to reboot.
Harold just came back in. He must have gotten dropped off, and we mentioned your comment, Harold, about dark reading and the fail to ban.
Yeah, I had a power outage here, so I'm back now.
You mentioned avoiding password reuse. That was a good point that that Wayne brought up. In two-factor authentication, I am of double minds on this. I'm so tired of Apple forcing me to go find my cell phone in order to do something. There must be a better way, but I don't know what it is. Chris Hayes mentions non-standard ports can help. I actually took my FTP to 22,000 something, and sure enough, the scanners found it. Not many, but some did. Let's see.
Well, you have to keep in mind they are programs continuously being executed. I use the example of a picture of a data center that basically they're sitting there scanning the public internet looking for potential targets. And it's not just one, there's multiples of that going on.
Yep. Brian pulled up the one that I was mentioning there about checking to see if your email or phone has been, it says, HTTPS, haveibeenpawned.com. And that is a place that 8 billion passwords and emails, sadly, they're all out there. Ted Langdale's got, who are you? These are all in the chat box, folks, if you're looking for them. And Elaine says she lost 10 years. Did you say this already, Elaine? I don't want to repeat you. Lost 10 years worth of photos due to a crashed backup drive.
Yeah, that was personal though. I mean, that was just my own idiocy and not checking things out for a long time. And then I went to pull up an old photo and couldn't access it. And I said, oh man.
George Cole asks, has anyone who's paid ransom ever received anything at all? I don't have much confidence in that.
Well, certainly they are war stories of people paying the ransom, and then the ransomware provider can't de-encrypt it because of problems and so forth.
Yeah.
And another thing we talked about ransomware encrypted, but a lot of times the ransomware involves copying information. And, there's, if you don't give us this money to de-encrypt, we're going to sell whatever this information is. Now, again, a lot of what we have as broadcasters, it's not credit card information. It's not that kind of stuff that has really a lot of value to it. And of course, I talked about cybercrime as a service. There's also, quote, on the dark web, plenty of sources to buy credit card lists. And, a name or an account number, a name, an expiration date in that security code, that has a lot of value to it in terms of its value on the black market.
And stunningly, they have customer service departments. Tim was mentioning that usually you'll get the key, not always, but usually, because they don't want to turn people off from them and not pay. But you deal with their customer service department.
Yep. And another thing that also with some past ransomware has been companies have paid the ransom, not because they didn't have backups, because yes, they had backups, but the restoration time to rebuild everything was so extensive, they felt it was cheaper from a business standpoint to pay the ransom and not have to restore the data.
Yeah, we can talk about a couple of broadcast groups that were off for a week or more. And then Elaine mentions the question, and this goes back to and I know for a fact, a group that's in Delaware, I think in Pennsylvania. What stops them from doing it again? Very often they've hidden the software on your hard drive. If you've been hit with ransomware, you've got to just clean that hard drive out or even get rid of it.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of responses, you don't even reuse the hard drive. I mean, it goes in the hard drive shredder, and you start brand new, even to the point of not even reusing, let's say, that server hardware again.
Okay, let's see. I've got a note here from Ted. He talks about how the modem at his transfer site gets a lot of hits, and I think Ted, Mark's point about whitelisting your modem is probably something you should consider.
What are your thoughts, Wayne, about dual authentication to be able to access things?
Well, I think that is a very positive thing to use. As Barry mentioned, it can be a pain at time.
Yep.
That is part of the balance that comes with cybersecurity between the usability, and the security. So there is a practical side to thing, but I think two-factor authentication is really a good thing, particularly again for that remote access.
We use it extensively to get into things here at the studio now, and
Yep.
I've told management, hey, it's going to take me a little longer to get in and do what I need to do to get something back on the air or whatever, because like Barry said, I'm looking for my phone.
Yep. Well, I've probably been spoiled a little bit within our university because I have a very large university environment surrounded me. There are some advantages, and we use Duo as far as a two-factor authentication. And for the most part, that works. Yeah, you got to have your phone sort of, but mine shows up on my Apple Watch, and I just hit my accept right there. And the phone can be in the bedroom on the charger, and I'm sitting in the easy chair with my iPad, and I can take care of my business there.
Tim, you're right. Security means you have to give up short-term convenience. Absolutely. Wayne, we've hit 90 minutes here, and I'm not chasing you away, buddies, but you did say you had to go somewhere.
I have another meeting to go off to, so I enjoyed the conversation with everyone. Cybersecurity certainly has become a really, really popular presentation topic for me, and something tells me that's going to continue because the problem is not going to likely go away.
Absolutely.
It will change.
Absolutely. And I sure thank you for taking the time for coming and delivering this. And as a side point, I just want to mention that as the soon-to-be past president of the SBE, you have worked hard to make improvements in many of the functions of the SBE. There are some that could complain about certain things, and Lord knows I've said my piece a time or three. But I know that that was a lot of extra work on your part, and I just want to commend you for that.
Well, thank you. I wish I could claim we got a lot more done in the past 2 years than we actually did. You know, a lot of good intentions maybe 2 years ago, and a lot of things changed in the world that got in the way of what I think were some good intentions. And certainly, I think we have a lot to be done. If you do receive the SBE signal, you'll probably read a little more about that in my my final president's column coming up in about another month.
Okay, and you will come back to us again on another Thursday someday and talk some more.
I look forward to it. I do not get to attend all of the Thursday events, but when I'm available, I very much enjoy them. It's a good group and a good offering you have.
Well, as I often tell the presenters as we discuss these things, and maybe you've seen it, and you didn't, I think, when we talked about it. In the program NCIS New Orleans, the lead character has a phrase that he uses with his team. He says, go learn things. That's what we want to do. Carry something home each week that we got new. And so we thank you and thank everybody that's here for the same reason. Now, a lot of thank you notes, Wayne, in the chat box. Okay.
Well, thanks everyone. It's been enjoyable.
Well, thanks again, and we'll look forward to another time. That will open the floor to any